So a warm welcome to you all here this evening. I'm Caroline Angel Burke, and on behalf of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, I'm thrilled that you're joining us for this very special Getting to the Point program. For those of you who are familiar with our work and our mission, we're so glad to have you back. And if you're joining us for the first time at the Institute, welcome to our full-scale replica of the United States Senate Chamber and to our Institute, which is dedicated to educating the public about the important role of the United States Senate in government, encouraging civic participation, and reinvigorating civil discourse. One of the differences, I think, between our DC counterpart and perhaps this room stems from a key reason why Senator Ted Kennedy and his wife Vicki Kennedy founded this organization: to invite us, all of us, regular people, to transform into the men and women who represent us in the real Senate, and get a sense of the kinds of skills necessary to join together and lead this nation. We offer programs daily that consider some of the key public policy issues that our elected officials currently debate. But as we transform ourselves into senators, we also are hoping to inspire a more longer-term transformation, that which will turn us all into more engaged citizens, community members, and Americans. This transformation is not limited to programmatic outcomes or constrained to policy topics. Space and setting are powerful influences and inspiration for all types of reflections. We as Americans, new and perhaps not so new, are invited in this space to reflect on what it means to participate in our democracy. For some of us, or for our ancestors, that participation was not extended to us until 1870, 1920, 1965, or maybe not even today. So what does it mean to be here in the United States in 2020? How are we connected to our fellow Americans nationwide when we sometimes feel so terribly different? How indeed do we define our differences, celebrate them, and weave them back into the fabric of this nation? Tonight we have the opportunity to approach our Americanism not through attempted legislation or ideological labels, but through the careful, beautiful, incredibly personal, and yet so truly relatable poetry of Richard Blanco. He's probably most well known for his 2013 appearance at the inauguration of President Barack Obama, where he gave a moving address entitled "One Today." In it, he exemplifies the many different backgrounds people have throughout the country and how they are all connected through one light, one ground, and one sky. Artistic expression comes in many forms, and as our distinguished speaker achieved, it can be created through poetry, featured at the highest levels and in front of millions. As the fifth inaugural poet in the United States history, joining the ranks of luminaries like Robert Frost and Maya Angelou, Mr. Blanco stands as the youngest, first Latino, immigrant, and gay person to serve in such a role. Ever since 2016, he's been on the Obama Foundation's Storytelling Committee. He's also the contributing poet to The Village Voice, a bi-monthly segment on Boston public radio station WGBH that discusses news topics through the lens of socially conscious poetry. His latest book of poems, How to Love a Country, I brought it up, seeks to both interrogate the American narrative, past and present, while celebrating the still unkept promise of its ideals. So we're so thrilled this evening to welcome Richard to join us to share some of his art, reflections, and journey with us all. I also have the honor to welcome our moderator to join him for a discussion. To serve in that role, the Institute is delighted to have Portia Olayiwola, the City of Boston's Poet Laureate. Ms. Olayiwola is the Artistic Director of Mass Leap, a literary nonprofit organization in Massachusetts serving youth artists, which the Institute takes pride in partnering with throughout the year. She's also co-founder of the House Slam, a poetry slam venue in Roxbury offering free poetry slam and open mic events twice a month. Portia's the 2014 Individual World Poetry Slam champion, and a year later, in 2015, the National Poetry Slam champion. In 2018, she was named GK 100 as Boston's most influential people of color. She's also an MFA candidate at Emerson College and has a full-length collection of poetry published in 2019 by Button Poetry. Portia, we're honored to have you here with us as well. And I'd like to invite you to both come up and start your discussion. Thank you.
So welcome, everybody. What an honor, what an incredible pleasure to be with all of you here today. Portia and I just kind of on the spot decided that we're going to switch up a little bit. I'm just going to read this poem, and then we're going to talk about it. I'm not going to make too many notes on it or say too much about it. And it is from the new book. Declaration of Interdependence. Such has been the patient sufferance, where mother's bread, instant potatoes, milk at a checkout line, where her 3 children pleading for bubble gum and their father, where the 3 minutes she steals the page through a tabloid, needing to believe even stars' lives are as joyful as bruised. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. Where her second job, serving an executive absorbed in his Wall Street Journal at a sidewalk cafe shadowed by skyscrapers, where the shadows of the fortune he won and the family he lost, where his loss and the lost, where a father in a coal town who can't mind a life anymore because too much and too little has happened for too long. A history of repeated injuries and usurpations. Where the grit of his main streets blacked out windows and graffitied truths, where a street in another town lined with royal palms, at home with a Peace Corps couple who collect African art, where their dinner party talk of wines wielded picket signs and burned draft cards, where what they know, it's time to do more than read the New York Times, buy fair trade coffee and organic corn. In every stage of these repressions, we have petitioned for redress. We're the farmer who grew that corn, who plows into his couch as worn as his back by the end of the day, where his TV set blaring news having everything, nothing to do with the field dust in his eyes, or his son nested in the ache of his arms. We are his son. We're a black teenager who drove too fast or too slow, talked too much or too little, moved too quickly, but not quick enough. We're the blast of the bullet leaving the gun. We're the guilt and the grief of the cop who wished maybe that he hadn't shot. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our honor. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We're the dead. We're the living amid flicker of vigil candlelight. We're in a dim cell with an inmate reading Dostoevsky, where his crime, his sentence, his amends, with a mending of ourselves and others. We're Buddhists serving soup at a shelter alongside a stockbroker. We're each other's shelter and hope. A widow's 50 cents in a collection plate, or golfer's 10,000 pledge for the cure. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We're the cure for the hatred caused by our own despair. We're the good morning of a bus driver who remembers our name, the tattooed man who gives up his seat on the subway, where every door held open with a smile. When we look into each other's eyes, the way we behold the moon, we are the moon. We are the promise of one people, one breath, declaring to one another, I see you. I need you. I am you. So,
in these times of hate, we need poets who speak of love. Richard Blanco's new collection is a visionary hymn of love to the human beings who comprise what we call this country. Whether he speaks in the voice of an immigrant who came here long ago, or the very river an immigrant crosses to come here today, Blanco sings and sings. This, the song says, is the way out for all of us. That was Martin Espada about how to love a country. I thought that was a great quote and a great description of this book. Can we give it up one more time for Richard Blanco, please? So I don't know if folks have their copies yet, but if you do, feel free to take it out and follow along with us as we do half interview, half questions. Yeah, it'll be a little bit of fun if we can. And I thought, yeah, that quote just blew me away, and I thought it to be so true, especially the singing. So I want you to tell us a little bit about this collection. What do you call it? Why did you call it this? Where did it come from? What was the process in writing it?
sure. I mean, a lot of it, ever since serving as presidential inaugural poet, or PIP, as I like to call it, as you know, Portia, like sometimes in our schooling and poetry is sort of very autobiographical, and that's also universal in its own way. But I was thinking about who am I, what am I, but that experience of being put on a stage where I had to account not just for myself, but for every single citizen in the United States, and made me start thinking about what is the civic role of the poet in our country? What is the civic role of poetry in our country? Also started thinking about my Latin American roots and my Caribbean roots and how poetry it has a different place in our societies too. Like poets get jailed, poets, it's part of our folklore, it's part of something, it's part of a collective voice, it's kind of the village voice. And so, really, it was the inauguration that started me thinking about this whole world of like, how am I going to step up in a way and say, this is no longer just about me. Although essentially it is, in the sense that I have always questioned my own place in America. Right. One of the hardest things of writing the inaugural poem, or of the task of being tapped, was, do I even love this country? No, seriously.
I think that's something that all of us
and does this
question.
country love me back? And the poem was a response to that, and saying, no, yes. The poem is the response. This is my narrative. This is who I am, is exactly what America is about. And I wasn't sure I knew that exactly. I think I was questioning that. So this book is a sort of a response in many other layers to that moment of understanding that there were many people like me that were asking that same question. Do I love this country? Does this country love me back? Do I belong to it? And I got the privilege and the honor, the humble honor of actually representing a lot of those people at that moment by speaking from the heart, honestly. And the poem was written, and as all poems are, they're written always to answer somehow a deep question that you have that somehow is also universal and relates to humanity at large. So that's where the book came about. It was just stepping up.
Yeah, that reminds me just of civic engagement and how that is rooted in love, right? We have country and love, which I also had the chance to pore over this book. But there's an epigraph at the beginning that I'm going to read it really quickly. But it's from James A. Baldwin, and it's, the role of the artist is exactly the same as the role of the lover. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. But that feels so fitting, to introduce the book, but also in line with what you say about civic engagement.
Yeah, of course. And then, you know, I always say in some ways the title of this book is also a question. You know, how do you love a country? What is a country? And of course, the way that Baldwin I always want to say Alec Baldwin too, and it's like my mistake.
The Baldwins.
Yeah, the Baldwins. Well, especially Alec Baldwin, you know. But anyway, you know, just thinking about Baldwin's body of work, it's so before its time too, in the sense of questioning all the layers that this book is questioning in terms of, and all the intersections of that, like, because I'm also sort of in a, you know, I'm Latino, gay, immigrant, an engineer, like, so there's all these layers.
Surprise.
And he was able to do that and question it in ways that were really interesting, and thinking about the intersectionality of all those things. So his work has always spoken to me in that sense. It's like in a time when I mean, to speak about it was much more daring and much more courageous than the time I'm living. But also that quote, it just touched me too, because it's out of love. So one of the things I didn't want this book to do, and we've all seen the kind of poetry that, you know, it's kind of preaching to the choir, and it's powerful, and there are things that need to be said and brought to light. But sometimes it's also ultimately, I think the poet's job is one of love. It's one of like, how can we offer a way out, a new conversation, something different to talk about, while still pointing out what we need to point out. But at the end of the day, if we just leave people divided, then what have we really accomplished? And so Baldwin's even, I mean, it's becoming more and more relevant even today, right? It's like this idea of, because it was also filtered through the autobiographical too, so it wasn't just about an outward sort of sense of, I'm going to call this and this out, but it was also filtered through real experience with real pain and real hurt. And I just identify it in this book, sort of touches so much of what he was working on. And again, the intersectionality of those pieces.
The personal is political.
Yeah.
Definitely believe that.
That's right.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit? So I had the pleasure of also talking with Richard a little bit before this whole meeting, and I was just, I picked the poems. I was like, these are my favorite poems. Can you please read these? But that one in particular, I just love that Declaration of Interdependence. I thought that was a fascinating way to start the book. And I just want to pick your brain. Why did you put that at the front of your book? And also, if you haven't picked up a copy yet, it's outside of all of the sections in the book, right? So it's the very first thing that we see, but I'm interested in that.
Like the furnace poem, and it becomes clear the manifesto for the whole poem. And this is something that may surprise you. Like, so this one has a funny story, and also election year. So before 2016 election, I just said about myself, giving myself an exercise as a poet. If Trump gets elected, what would an inaugural poem look like for Trump? And that's just, so you know, this is like, I mean, I don't like to divide. I still think about how we bring it, but I really, really wanted to question. And I was like, and this was before, of course, we knew much about the presidency still. So I'm thinking, what is this weird space, and what would I write? And I couldn't write a poem that really addressed Trump directly. So in a way, it was a spin-off of all these other poems. What it did, it started making me think deeper and deeper about what is a democracy? What is an election? If he does get elected, is that, you know, how do we, does a democracy, is it larger than one person? Mm-hmm. And so it started really making me think about our language, our history, the history of democracy. And as poems are weird, they're just, you know, how they come together. There's this wonderful saying, not a saying, but the greeting of the Zulu people, and it's when they greet each other every day, they don't say like good morning, like good morning in the elevator, and you're like, ugh, whatever, yeah, good morning, yeah, how are you doing? Oh, fine. And my cat just died, but I'm fine, you know, like, or whatever.
Yeah, totally.
They look you straight in the eye and
tell you how you are.
Yeah. I see you. And they say, I see you. And so that has always stayed with me. And where that poem came is like that we're not seeing each other in America anymore. And how we can discount entire groups of people by what color they are on an electoral map, as if nobody in that color is good, or depending on our opinion, how in a way, yeah, we've just sort of abstracted each other, and knowing that at the end of the day we have more in common than we don't. So that was part of what the poem was doing, and thinking about, let's see each other, and let's understand that the assumptions we're making about the person on the bus, or the person at the grocery store, or someone on a news broadcast, that those are assumptions we're making, and they're broad generalizations. That, and the idea that also comes from the Buddhists, which is there's 3 levels of sort of consciousness, well, not consciousness, but of understanding. One is dependence, right? That's the lowest, the idea that you have to be dependent on somebody or something, right? Whether that's money or whatever it is. Then there's independence, which is the Declaration of Independence, the idea that we have autonomy. But the next level, which is this country really needs to get to, I think, interdependence. The fact that all of the quality of each of our lives depends on the quality of your neighbor and the neighbor across the country. And I think we're getting there despite what we feel right now. I think we're in a process of really trying to deal with that, and that we're all interdependent, whether you recognize it or not. The quality of your life depends on dozens and dozens of people around you, and what they do every day when they wake up in the morning. And what you do also every day when you wake up in the morning adds to the quality of life. And so the idea of interdependence versus dependence, I was just trying to twist the Declaration of Independence, like bring it up to like a new, and it's really funny taking excerpts from that. We could almost address those same questions. It's funny, I'm in the space right now, but we could address almost those same questions to our senators and to Congress. Our petitions had been met by nothing, that somehow we need to also understand that we have a right and an autonomy as people in a democracy to still demand not independence, but demand interdependence. And that's kind of like with a poem,
totally.
kind of shot at me.
Yeah, I think sometimes even demanding out of love can be a thing and a reality. You mentioned Trump, in the election year.
Did you say chump or
Trump. I did not say chump. I said Trump, no. Is that poem about the year that President Trump was elected? The election year poem?
It was written before. Something in me knew that there was obviously a polarization growing in this country, and something that I just kind of, again, that Trump was, I said, what if he gets something? So it was also like, what if so he wasn't elected yet, but something me kind of knew. Election year, just so you all know, is kind of.
Will you share it after as well?
Sure, I'd love to. It was just a hard thing to tackle. I mean, how do you tackle something so large and big as this political landscape or this moment in our country? We've just elected a 2-term African-American president. There's the verge of this. And I just started thinking about how to solve that as a poet. I mean, I'm not going to hit it head on because that's a book, right? That's a nonfiction book. And I thought of the allegory of a garden and living in Maine, part of the year where you like tending the garden and thinking of democracy as a garden and its citizens are the gardeners, right? And sometimes we got to realize that sometimes we do everything right and the garden still fails, or sometimes, and I see it in Maine especially. And if you don't tend the garden enough, in like 2 days, that thing will turn around like, oh, the garden's fine. Not in Maine, right? And so just thinking all the allegorical connections about tilling the soil, about how nature finds a way to also, because in a way, a garden is an artificial construct, and in a way, so is a democracy. I mean, all social constructs are not, they're constructs, right? So we need to tend to them. We need to sort of think and keep on evolving them and keep on like thinking about it. So the poem itself becomes all these subtle notions of how the gardener, we as citizens, deal with a democracy, our duties, our failures, our surrenders to the garden. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll read that one.
Please. I believe it's the first poem in the book.
Yeah, I just got it. I think I have it here.
On page 5, if folks are following along.
Yeah, let me, I got this one here. I should know myself, right? So there's a great video on YouTube of this poem as well. Election year, and so that's the only hint, really, right? As you notice, it's all an allegory. The last ghostly patch of snow slips away. Winter's peaceful abandon slowly melting into memory, and you remember the muck outside your kitchen window is the garden you promised to keep, must struggle with once more. Jeans dyed black by years of dirt, you step again into the ache of your boots. Clear dead spoils, trowel the soil for new life. April sun shifts on the horizon, lights up the dewed spiderwebs like chandeliers. Clouds begin sailing in, cargoed with rain, loud enough to rouse the flowers into a race for color. The rouged tulips clash with the lilies, flaunting their noble petals at the brazen puffs of alum. The mauve tongues of iris gossip sweet nothings to the wind trembling through petunias. Mornings over coffee and news of the world, you catch the magic act of hummingbirds, appearing, disappearing. The eye tricked into seeing how the garden flowers thrive in shared soil, drink from the same rainfall, governed by one sun, yet grow divided in their beds, where they've lain for years. In the ruts between bands of color, ragweeds poke their dastard heads, dandelions cough their poison seeds, and thistles, like daggers, draw their spiny leaves and take hold. The garden loses ground all summer, calls you to your duty. With worn gloves molded by the toll of your toil, armed with shears, you tear weeds, snip head-bowed blooms, prop their struggling stems. Butterfly wings wink at you, hinting it's all a ruse. As you rest on your deck, proud of your calloused palms and pained knees, trusting all you've done is true enough to keep the garden abloom. Then overnight, a vine you've never battled creeps out of the dark furrows, scales the long necks of the sunflowers, chokes every black-eyed Susan, and coils around the peonies, beheading them all. You snap apart its greedy tendrils, cast your hands back into the dirt, pull at its ruthless roots, yet it returns with equal fury, equal claim. The poppies scream red, the blue asters grasp for air, strangled in its vile clasp that lives by killing everything it touches. Fall opens with the sun's eye closing earlier beyond the mountains, and you lose sleep, uncertain if the garden you cherish will survive, despite your care. It's not simply the winter you worry about, but something we call hope, pitted against despair, something we can only speak of by speaking to ourselves about flowers. A garden tended under a constitution of stars we must believe in, splayed across the sky.
Wow. A constitution of stars. I love that line. And, I could be wrong, but it's like one of the only political terms in this poem other than the title.
Right.
I think it's fascinating. I think that's so fascinating that it's called Election Year and about gardening.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit? You talked a little bit about the toil, but...
Well, I was just thinking. I mean, it was one of the different. It was a very. Ask my partner Mark. It was it was a very difficult poem to write because it's all about subtle. It's all about inference. It's all about how do I obviously the red poppies mean something, but you can never say anything, right? You don't because that's the power of the poem till that last moment. The Constitution of Stars, sort of the title and that last word, sort of bring the poem together, and it was just sort of stitching because I think. There's so much big back and forth. Politics can become so abstracted and just, issues, words just become blank. And I thought, how can we ground what a democracy is or what we're really battling with or what we're really striving for with tangible sort of elements, tangible things that we can relate to. And again, like this sort of, like almost like a fairy tale, well, like an allegorical fairy tale. And then the idea, again, part of it, there were little pieces of it, how, we plant things in beds, separated from each other, how sometimes there is this weed that we had no idea was coming, and you think everything's fine, and the garden fails. How, in a sense, the last few stanzas are you just, in a way, also have to trust that you do the work you do in the garden.
And then at night.
And at night, yeah. And so, we don't always know, but we have to believe that something, or we don't know, actually. Now you're making me think, maybe we don't know, but you still got to show up. Yeah. You still got to tend the garden. And just because the garden is failing, you still got to show up. And hope pitted against despair. Yeah. That is, in a way, a democracy. We're always, in a way, pitting hope against things that fight against that, right? There's always this constant give and take, give and take, give and take. And we're not the first generation to see that. Certainly, I think every generation has had a version of that, of the garden, right? Where all is lost, and then you realize, wait, maybe it's not all lost, right? I got to go back in the garden. Yeah. I got to go back and figure this out. Or sometimes you realize you haven't tended to the garden for a while, and you know what? I need to go back to the garden. Yeah. It's my duty, right?
Yeah, so such a great metaphor. I'm thinking about just feeding folks, Yeah. And even, the biblical references of gardens is just really interesting.
I thought about that.
You're just
the
talking,
the proverbial garden of life, right?
Yeah, totally. And so forth and so on. It can go on, but, this is not about my theories. I also noticed, they mentioned, I'm currently at Emerson, and, MFA candidates, we get very snuffy about poems, and we want to know, about the line break and why this word, so I'm about to go there. But interested in the blocks. I noticed I'm pretty sure the entire book, is written in blocks, almost prose blocks. Some of them are not necessarily prose blocks, but these longer lines. And I enjoy it very much, but I'm interested in the move. Why did you make that move?
Well, it's something that every poem sort of demands finds its own way in. But also, I think because this poem, this book in particular, I don't know, had a different quality to it. It was more about speaking to us all, and it took on a different kind of flavor. It took more of a conversational tone, and the line breaks sometimes weren't working for me. They weren't what the poem was demanding of me. And I always choose to write block when I feel like the line breaks are interrupting the poem rather than really creating drama or tension in the poem. I think I've always been a fan, in some ways, of prose poetry or prose poems. Also, I think it dates back to my own working class, immigrant kid, who see anything in line breaks and you freak out. Like, oh my God, it's a poem. Like, I don't know anything about poetry. Like, so I think, I don't know, it was a great question. I'm not sure that I did it so consciously, but I wanted to have a book that was kind of a conversation with America. And so I think a lot of the poems, more than usual, ended up becoming not so much the high poetics of the line break or anything like that, but sort of just letting people just breathe in the book in a different way. Because this is, I think, a book. I wanted to have not this conversation with the average Joe, so to speak, or even the average Jane, or even the non-average Joe or Jane, or anything in between. But also, I didn't want people to be intimidated by the conversation of poetry. And I never thought about that, so you asked me that. I think part of it was having prose blocks makes people a little more comfortable in that language and not feeling like it's these high poetics that are going on. Yeah.
Yeah. It also reminds me, I hope this feels like a compliment, but of something like an official document. I see it as almost instructions on how to love a country. So, that was my own theory behind it.
No, that makes sense too. I mean, in some ways, right, like the Declaration of Independence isn't written in line breaks, so it was kind of difficult to pull off that in line breaks. I'm like, no, I want to use prose. So much of the language of our country is obviously the Constitution is not written in line breaks. Totally. That's true. Like, yeah. I think there's elements of that as well. Yeah.
And it also makes sense what you said about prose because, as a person who is attempting to bridge people in this country, it makes sense that you don't want it to be a gap in the reading, right?
Right.
If it's more accessible this way. Can I ask you to share more poems?
Sure.
Yeah. Let's see. That last one was a surprise. It wasn't on my list at all. Okay. This is slightly selfish, but we are in Boston. So there's a poem called Remembering Boston Strong that you were commissioned to write. And you read it some years ago at Fenway Park and somewhere else.
Right.
But can you read it here with us as well?
Yeah, this is special for us.
Mostly,
right?
we all love to hear about ourselves.
So this is obviously has to do with the after the Boston Marathon bombings, and it was post not that everything, but it was post the bombers were captured, and I started as this big celebration at the TD. What do you know? It's like I want to call it Boston Garden. The
TD Garden.
TD Garden, right? And some of you may have been there, and like, so I read at the inauguration, and like, this was more intimidating. I'm like opening up for like Steven Tyler and like James Taylor, and I'm like, nobody wants to hear a poem in this place, like. I mean, these are Bostonians. I mean, like
that's how we always feel.
They're like having like a beer. They're like having hot dogs. They're like, I thought I was going to be booed off stage. But it's really beautiful to speak about poetry. You could hear a pin drop, not because I'm not creative a poet, but moments like this is demands. But it was a prayer, and it was the prayer that opened the whole evening. Wow. And what was interesting about this, I'm not a Bostonian. I wasn't here to, and it's really becomes a poem of tribute to the strength, the courage, and also the turmoil and the tragedy, and so it's addressed to second person, which was in a poetic choice, right?
We're on 64, if folks are following.
Yeah, there you go. Remembering Boston Strong. Years from now, you'll wish all you remember was how spring arrived just as you expected, the icicles gone as magically as they appeared, the snow seeped back into the earth just as you had trusted it would, the thawed Charles and a river of runners ribboning that morning through the city that was a city long before our nation was a nation, while the ivy scribbled, climbed, turning green the red bricks your great-great-grandfathers laid. Memories mortared in every city wall and chimney. But years from now, you'll still remember this, the unexpected smoke that wasn't a spring fog, pink-purple blossoms mingled with the sparkle of shattered glass strewn over Boylston Street, bursting red. Red maple's tiny leaves opening like newborn hands to cup April's rain. The lives of two girls with names as pretty as mayflowers who would never bloom. The irony of the race ending with the mangled feet and legs of those wheeled away by those who did not run away. And the boy, the son, everybody's son, his life outlived by the budding tulips of window boxes dressing up the city, suddenly frozen in spring. Daylight each day a few minutes longer, but baseball diamonds dulled and muted. The sky each day a tint bluer, but stadiums abandoned. Every seat an empty nest. The wind each day a hint warmer, but park benches cold. And quiet swings like pendulums stopped. Each night crickets louder in your ears, but winter set still in your eyes, caught in the glow of television sets, casting shadows of the news across living rooms and hollow city streets locked down in silence. And years from now, what you will mostly want to remember is not the shootout that ended the silent waiting, nor the bombers' names, nor the blasts, but the tender roses you laid across the finish line, the thankful praise you gave for the lives saved by lives in their arms, the brave promises of those who vowed to walk, dance, and run again. The stadiums and ballparks again filled with anthems sung by you, like 1,000 songbirds at once, a chorus into a second spring you had not expected. Dandelions still pushing through pavement cracks, spiders still spinning, forsythia still bursting yellow, elms still growing taller, and ivy still climbing the enduring walls of the city. Still a city, but a whole lot stronger.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I guess this is what you mean about being a civic poet, right? Is being called upon to do some of these difficult things. And I don't know, I guess I'm curious. This is, again, my own selfish question. I'm interested in what was it like to first be called, who called you? Did Obama call you and ask you to do this poem, to write this poem? What was it like to write the poem? What was it like to be in the room? All of those things. I'm sure I'm not the only person who wants to know.
In my memoirs, it will be Obama that calls me directly. Yeah, he's kind of busy. I get called by the surrogate. Only a government could figure out this term. The title was surrogate of scheduler of surrogates. It's just like someone in charge. And then there was a complete joke. I'm like, this is my friend Brian. It was like, put somebody up to this. I'm like, you don't expect this phone call. And it's really cute because they actually ask you, like, I didn't get what they were saying, what she was saying. I was like, do you want me to come to the White House and read a poem? Like, she just lost her patience with me. It's like, no, like, Robert Frost and Maya Angelou. I'm like, oh, so this really is a joke. So then and then she said, are you available that day? I'm like, let me think about it. I was like, yeah, I think I can move the Queen of England to Tuesday and the Pope to Thursday.
That's great.
And but it was something really humble about like asking me if I was available. Some little working class gay kid from a Cuban immigrant family, you know, like I said, I think so. But anyway, I mean, so that was part of like. I have a small memoir that details a lot of that, the funny of it, the scary of it, like all of it. And then I was just like, okay, and I Googled the person and I was like, okay, this is for real. Like, and then instead of being terrified, my first overwhelming emotion was one of gratitude. Not because of what was going to happen. I didn't even know what was going to happen, but of my parents and my grandparents, the choices they made, the sacrifices they made, leaving another country. It became a quintessential, I suddenly realized why they did that. And it came down to this moment, I had to pull over the side of the road and just weep. And like their insistence in education, we couldn't put the air conditioner on in our house. We lived in Miami, but my parents, just so we could be able to pay for a little bit of a better education. So all that flooding of all that stuff. So things kind of fly by. This is December 12th. I have to be on the stage on January 21st. I have 3 weeks to write 3 poems. They asked me to write 3 poems, and then they chose one today. It was just, I mean, it's so life-changing, so interesting, and so funny, and so heart-wrenching, and so there's so many different dimensions to that whole experience. But I got to say two sort of really interesting things, and I think I touched on that further earlier, is the poem brought to a head, that's, do I love this country? And does this country love me back? Am I really an American? And realizing, again, that poem, and that was breakthrough for me. Like, that was something I had always been questioning my work in some ways, but here it was, and you're going to read that poem to 40 million Americans, right? So that was one thing. The other thing that really struck me as really, really fascinating, besides meeting Beyonce, and like, it's just like Obama was great, but Beyonce, like, if we could put them together, that would be like the most awesome thing. That it would be Obanse or something, like, it's just like,
That's great.
that's who should run for president. But anyway, when I get it, I really didn't have much contact with him during the inauguration because it's a crazy time, but he invited us to the Oval Office. And one of the things that always stayed in my head is like, how do you trust me? How do you trust me to not get up there, number one, read like an Allen Ginsberg poem?
That's great.
Give it to him. Give the finger to America. How do I not get up there and just sort of like lose it and like just go like, oh, mommy? How do I not just faint? like literally.
How do you trust me?
And his answer was such a gracious and interesting one. He said, he used the royal language, he said, we find that in these situations, people always rise to the occasion. Took me a while, because with Obama, it takes you a while to realize what he's really saying, because he knows what you're thinking before you even know what you're thinking.
That's great.
And what he was saying is like, you trust the democracy. And if you don't trust the democracy, then it's all over. And so the idea was, yeah, you could have done this and you could have done, but we trust that you believe in something like that I believe in. And that was one of the most fascinating moments with him. It was scarier meeting him in the Oval Office and even then, like, being at the inauguration. It was like, that's so like, but it's a blur in some ways. Totally. But like, you have nowhere to run in the Oval Office. You just keep going around in a circle.
Can you imagine?
Oh, and then the other thing, may I gossip a little? You want me to gossip
Totally.
a little bit?
I love a little gossip.
So then what happened, like, my partner Mark was with me, and we're like, okay, like, I also didn't want to be disillusioned. What if this guy's like movie stars? Like, what if this guy's like a real jerk? And I'm not saying, I've never been an Obama fan. I mean, I always loved him and his story, and more so than necessarily the letter, the letter of his policy or anything like that, but just him as an American, the symbol of an American dream or whatnot. But anyway, we give him the poem etched in this kind of glass thing, and he's a hugger. He hugs me, I'm like, okay, he's hugging me now, and then we give him the thing, and he's like, oh, this is beautiful, guys, and he's like, let me show you where I'm gonna put it, and like,
That's a great impression, by the way.
he's like, come on, and I'm like, okay, and then he like, kind of would like follow him, and he pushes some like fake door in the Oval Office that leads to the back room. And it's this little den where there's like pictures of Muhammad Ali and like things that are personal to him, and a little tiny desk, like with a little computer, and he said, "This is where I put all the stuff that I like, not all that political mumbo jumbo they give me." It's something to that effect, and it was just his personal space. But it also spoke to me of the democracy. Everybody been to the West Wing. It's really small, actually. It's not that, but this is the center of the most powerful empire in history, and he's got a little desk, a little den with an ottoman, like pictures of Muhammad Ali and like Maya Angelou, Baldwin, and it spoke to our democracy, and I was like, wow, that's the way it was intended. Like, there's no Picasso's hanging in there. There's no, it was just the humility of this is the farmers. Yeah.
A room for gardening.
So all that sort of spoke to me. There's a lot more, but like, I'll give you those two.
Totally, we can talk after. No. Okay, so I do have one more poem I would love for you to read, and it is really, I think I'm really attracted to this idea of being called upon to love on people. And so I would love to hear the poem, but I want to open it up for question and answers, and maybe we can close on that.
Oh, sure. That's a good idea, yeah.
Okay.
Well, close on a poem.
Do folks have questions? I don't want to hog the mic, but if folks have questions, okay, right here.
I'm curious, because of your position as a special poet, will you be writing a poem for the next inauguration?
Oh, will I be writing a poem as presidential inaugural poet? No. So the office, it's not really an office, but so there's only been 5, and so each president will pick a poet, and only obviously the Democrats. Kennedy started the tradition, so it's become a Democratic Party tradition. Yeah. So the good thing is like you will always be presidential inaugural poet. So you will always be a presidential inaugural poet, no matter who but you also have to clarify for which president. So I often think about that because, like U.S. people think a lot of people in the United States, which speaks to the idea of how, how poetry isn't as well known in the United States, or isn't as accessible, I should say. But people think I'm U.S. Poet Laureate, and I'm in the Poet Laureate of the inauguration. But because the role is more public even than the U.S. Poet Laureate, it's really interesting, and I love that role because that's kind of the role I always wanted in my life. Because as a kid that was denied access to poetry, not denied, but didn't have access to the arts, so I love that I get to read at the USDA, I get to read at the Fragrance Foundation Award. I've had the most incredible gigs where they bring in poetry because that moment is so public. But to answer your question, no. So in England, that is the case. So the Poet Laureate, in America, it's different because the Poet Laureate's office is run out of the legislative branch, which has to do with the library and the Library of Congress, and so it comes in, and the presidential inaugural poet is obviously chosen through the executive branch. And so it's kind of different in the United States. And yet my role is so much more public because it's 40 million people listening to a poem, which doesn't happen in America very often. But I would want to petition that I be the inaugural poet for the rest of history. And I have often said, I'm sort of watching the Democratic primaries right now, going like, maybe I should send a little, I got a couple other poems for you if you're interested. But also you don't lose the title. And I remember as a little kid, God, as a little gay kid, when they would take like the crown off Miss America, like it was like, God, that's so rude. They don't do it anymore. But I'm like, so I'm never decrowned. I will always be President Obama's presidential inaugural poet. You're never former presidential inaugural poet, like you're former poet laureate. So I got to thank my stars for that. But it's funny. It's a weird position. What's that? They'll probably choose somebody else. I mean, I would offer, they might consult me to help choose someone. And I mean, honestly, I don't want, I mean, because what we want to do is, it's interesting because if you look at the snapshots of the five, it is this brilliant, those moments really bring this brilliant snapshot of what America is at each moment. And when we think we're not making sort of progress as a nation, if you look at Robert Frost, and in less than 60 years, you get an immigrant, gay, Latino kid, it says a lot about America, right? And not to diss Frost, but it was like, you know, white male, you know. And so if you look at how it happens, Maya Angelou, you know, Amelia Williams, you sort of, and so I think each presidency wants to reflect what what that moment means and what their presidency means. And in my case with Obama, you know, when I had the chance to speak with it, because I didn't know how I was selected either, and I don't know exactly yet, but in conversations with him post that, he was generationally just like me, growing up wondering, do I even belong to this country? Does this country love me? Do I even love it? What does this country mean? Am I part of this narrative? Do I, you know, and in his case, a layer of race, not just cultural, but race. And so I think partly our connection through the work was that same kind of struggle that signified sort of late 20th century, early 21st century of people that were finally coming up through the ranks of America, but also had a lot of questions growing up and a lot of, and whose parents had a lot of struggle and had to deal with a country that necessarily wasn't tuned into who they were. I'll let you pick.
We'll go here and then.
Hi, I'm a real fan of your poetry. I used the 17 Funerals poem in a class I was teaching called Writing the Social Justice Commentary. I was using it to inspire them, but I also wanted them to think about how you could sort of quickly capture what was going on in the world through writing. And I'm curious, maybe this is a process question, but I'm curious, like, did you write this right after Parkland? Was this something you've been thinking about a long time because of all the mass shootings? Could you kind of tell me how this came about?
So in the inaugural poem, you have Sandy Hook directly reference, I mean, not by name, but reference. And that happened while I was writing the inaugural poem. And I got to say, I mean, who doesn't have a sensitivity to these kinds of things? But also, with Parkland in particular, I grew up in Miami, and so this is like my backyard. And this was closer, as was Paul's. Like, you know, it was like Orlando, you know. So there's immediate sort of, your ears perk up a lot quicker even in this world where we're starting to get desensitized to that idea. But what was really ultimately really inspiring about was the poem is the kids and what they did afterwards. And when I heard what triggered it was when I heard that they had to go to 12 funerals. I mean, 17 funerals in 12 days. And I lost it. Because it became real. And that's why there's all the numbers in the poem. The poem is called 17. It's like 17 this, 17 that, 17 the other, and like 17 mornings and 17. And so, you know, every poem comes with two things. One is like, or three things. One is like you have a response to something, right? The other thing is you have a trigger that says, oh, I hear the voice of the poem, the inspiration, if you will, and then the execution of it and how that unfolds itself. So in that particular poem, that's how it happened. But each poem happens in a different way, like in similar but slightly different ways. But at the end of the day, it was what those kids started taking on, and that's how the poem ends, right? Like 17 more reasons for us to believe that this will end, and it's because of the survivors and the students that took things into their own hands.
Said we go here.
Hello. This book is wonderful. You display how to love a country throughout the book. And even more, I would say that making comment on your poem, Matters of the Sea, and the second, would that then be paragraph or stanza, says, no one is other
To the other.
to the other, to the sea. And the sea, you know, is a universal motion. And that motion is energy. And we ourselves are energy. And the universality and unity of that energy is in this poem. And so our country is, in itself, we're universal and connected to each other, but at the same time to the rest of the world and the universe.
Yeah.
I mean, that you pulled it right out there.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's a very significant line for me in that poem. No one. It's actually, speaking about inspiration, that's the first line that came to me. And that experience of, so this is a poem that I read. It was asked to write and read for the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Havana, the reopening, I should say, and started me thinking about what our country is. First of all, so this book is also question mark, right? It's also like, what is a country, right? What does that really mean in the 21st century, right? How do we, and so that line, no one is the other to the sea, and that one, there's another line in there that also says, no matter what anthem we sing, right? We've all held seashells to our ears, right? And so part of the arc of the book, which is very subtle, but it's also like getting away from what is becoming more and more of a problematic idea of how we think about country, or what is a country, or what is, in a world that's completely interconnected, that the idea of like there's these nation states with neat little borders, and we have, you know, but you're seeing it in the world that's scary too, right? That's scary because still as human beings, we're still we need kind of parameters. We need to say, I am this, and I'm not that, right? And we're seeing knee-jerk reactions that are scary. Brexit, to me, is part of that, right? These other, I'm not gonna, as Archie Bunker would say, I won't mention any names, I'll just glance at the body and whistle. Come on, y'all know Archie Bunker. But, you know, the elephant in this room, so to speak. In some ways, it doesn't surprise me that our country is going through this right now, because that letting go of a narrative, that letting go of the tribal, I am this, I am from this tribe, is a big step in human evolution, human psychological evolution at least. And so that poem was important to me because I also realized that I'm not Cuban, I'm not American, I am both, none, either. I am a citizen of the world, and we have to more and more start thinking about ourselves that way, because nature really doesn't care about borders.
Yeah,
Nature doesn't really understand what the colors on a map are, like, please, you know.
Do you have any questions on this side of the room? We do.
Oh yeah, sorry.
We'll go here and then over there.
I'm curious, besides reading other people's poems, what are the books that you read to, you know, some of the poetry is just beautiful, but it's very, as you say, political. I'm curious as to what you like to read when you're not doing poetry or reading poetry.
What kinds of stuff I'm reading or read for this book in particular? In general, I always have my posse of Latino poets, and that are still sort of important in my life, not just for the work, but also by who they are. I've also gotten a lot of influence lately from a lot of spoken word artists, spoken word poets, and the political edge that they've maintained for many years, while many of us academic poets are just, you know, writing about the cow in the field, you know, you know what I'm talking about, right? So in some ways, we owe a lot of what's going on in poetry to a distinct group of more orally based poets that kept, poetry was always the village voice. It was always a kind of campfire around which people could gather to share and debate stories, right? It was an oral tradition. for thousands of years. It was public before before we started reading it on the page. So that's always been an inspiration, or has been re-inspiring me. Poets like Rachel McKibbins, for example, who are political without just, but like you said, even the person is political, and trying to understand what that means in me, because I didn't want to just be political for the sake of being political. But other than that, stylistically, Elizabeth Bishop has always been a really important influence in my work, mostly stylistically, but also emotionally, because she was exiled in some ways her whole life, effectively orphaned when she was 4 years old. So all my work comes down to the question of home. And so there's a lot of authors, home, belonging, identity, and that, I'm very generous with that. And I think there's a lot of people, you could be born in the home, the same town your great-grandfather was born in. You could have come over in the Mayflower. We all question what home is, and especially in our country, which is, still trying to figure out how to make one of the many. Home is the essential American question. What are we shaping here? How is this one family? Really big questions. But anyway, I digress. But I have important poems. I don't really follow poets religiously in that sense. I think every poet has one or two or maybe three masterpieces that continue to teach me all my life, from Derek Walcott to Patricia Smith to Wallace Stevens to Ada Limon to T.S. Eliot. Did I say T.S. Eliot? So yeah, I look at individual poems a lot too, that continue to teach me what a poem is or should be.
Thank you. We'll go here and then over there. And then will you?
Hello, Mr. Blanco. I love the way that your poems are written. I think it's very interesting. I also think it's very interesting how you actually orally present them. And I was just wondering what your thought process was, like what words do you emphasize, what words do you elongate, what words do you shorten? I just wanted like a little insight on how you go about orally presenting them.
Sure. You can answer. You can answer to that. So, like I was saying about the DNA of poetry still rests a lot in music and oral tradition, and it's like music. You just have to sing it, and you sing it again, and you practice it again, and your body starts telling you how to do it. I'm not consciously aware. My body is the one that remembers which breaths to take, like a song, right? You practice it enough times that you hear it a certain way, and it's really interesting about poetry, which is the bad part about a poem on a page, is that if you really hear a poem read, or even when we talk to each other, we're singing, right? We're not talking, we're singing to each other, right? Our inflections, our gestures, like the pauses. You would literally have to write musical notes on top of my poem, even though the language has built-in music, certainly rhyme and rhythm and assonance and consonants. But those more subtle parts of what is oral tradition is part of, we've been doing that since we're sitting around the campfire, singing, telling stories. And so I don't premeditate it. I just know enough to like really read it a lot before. And it's also, even reading it alone in my room doesn't quite work all the time. I have to have this energy that actually inspires me how to read it, because I'm feeling your energy all, and I'm feeling like how it wants to be read. So it's kind of, I imagine, a lot like music. It starts creating a melody in your head, and it changes sometimes because you improv too. Sometimes you'll read it a little bit differently depending on the crowd, and not consciously. So, but what I want to say, it's a craft. It's part of the craft that I think a lot of poets have, including myself, we're never versed in, pardon the pun, but we were never taught that your voice is an instrument, and a poem doesn't exist in some ways until it's spoken. Even poems by others that you're reading, read them out loud. They have to become part of your body, and you'll understand them in a different way, in the way that when we sing out loud to a song on the radio, we feel it, right? We we feel it different. And I feel like the same way. The poems sometimes teach me, by reading them over and over again, they teach me what they really mean to my heart that wasn't necessarily conscious when I was writing it. It's there subconsciously, but it's not conscious till I hear that voice. I hear the room. The poem exists. I don't think a poem is done until this happens. It's not done. This is the full incarnation of a poem.
Okay, we have time for one more question, unfortunately, and we'll give it to you right there. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was talking about her back there with the microphone. But maybe, I think we're going to do book signing anyway, so if you have more questions, you should feel free.
Okay. You mentioned that we're not like. Sorry. You mentioned that we're not seeing each other anymore in America, and we're like discounting masses of people. And when you said that, it kind of reminded me of the census and how it's being used as a tool to disregard people in different communities and their needs. And I was just wondering, like, would you be willing to write about that in the near future if you haven't already? And what exactly would you say?
Wow, totally. You're
That's great.
I mean,
Great last question.
so are you actively involved in working on the census, or is this something that's coming in? Right. Well, you're making me think, right? Like, we can abstract things in all different kinds of ways, right? And use numbers and figures, and we can use, and so, thank you. I gotta say, like, I'm seeing a list poem right now in my head, like with the data, right, and then working with that found text to say, well, what does that really mean? X% of this does that, or because it is a way of abstracting. It's a way. I mean, I gotta say, it's also useful in some ways, as they have told us, to really count people and what our needs are and who we are actually, just demographically. But then, as we all know with statistics, it can be twisted and abstracted and used in all different kinds of ways to prove whatever you want, right? I know as a mathematician as well, but thank you. I think that's a wonderful experience. But to take your point, like, that was really, I think we've all had those experiences where, like, we just can discount and abstract people for, I mean, it's gotten so pervasive, right, that I say this as a joke sometimes. I'm like, if you drive a Subaru, what party are you? If you drive a red pickup truck, what party are you? The pickup truck could be two gay guys from Vermont that make goat milk soap. You don't know that, right? But we just assume, and so, like, it's gotten so pervasive how we keep on, where you shop, what kind of car you drive, what shoes you wear. It's gotten more and more pervasive that we're not really looking at each other. And let me tell you, I'm not preaching. I get that too. Sometimes I got to stop myself. I'm like, you know what, Richard, maybe that person just had a bad day, or like, I don't know. I find myself sort of really just abstracting things by what people, how they act, what they say, what they do, without even really interacting with them. And it's like, that's horrible. Like, and on a large scale, with media and social media, the power of that abstraction is huge. It's huge, and I mean, we've all been there, right? And so what I wanted to do, close off where we started, what I wanted to do with that poem is something that's not a very popular thing to talk about, but that there is a liberal blind side too, right? There's like, and a lot of Latino writers are writing about that now too, like that there is this kind of blind side that we're not aware of sometimes, like, oh, you don't look Cuban. What is that? Or like, here's the best line at a cocktail party. I want to go to Cuba before it changes. Like, do you know what you're saying to me? Like, I'm a balanced. I've been to Cuba 20 times, I know what you're saying in some regard, but it's kind of like, you're not looking at me. You're not looking at me. You're looking at an abstract idea of a third world country that exists for some kind of fantasy about a world without Starbucks, which you probably go to every morning. So like, but I'm just saying, it's something I just try to create in that poem. What I'm trying to do is create awareness across the board, how we judge, how right judges left judges right, conservative judges liberal judges left, and when you come down, I think sometimes the differences come down to a hair. Sometimes, but if we can't connect with our humanity and our interconnectedness, then the abstraction becomes infinite. You just keep abstracting and abstracting and abstracting ourselves till we're no longer human beings. And that is a very scary thing. It's happened in history. This is what creates genocides. This is what creates when people are abstracted to the point that they're not human anymore, that they don't have families, they don't have a mother or a father, that they don't have, anyway, Blanco for president. Missed it by 45 days. I arrived when I was 45 days. Even though it was named after Richard Nixon. This doesn't leave the chambers.
It's live stream. Do we have time for one more poem, or? Yes, so I'm actually gonna let you choose it. I won't choose it. But if there's a poem that you have to leave us with, please go ahead.
And I kind of always end on this one because, or try to end on this one, just because in a moment where we need, I think, where I think we need, so the book is heavy, obviously, and there's a lot, writing that book in some ways took me on my own journey, because it investigates a lot of not pretty things about historically and presently. And so towards the end of the book, I want to leave us with something that gives us hope, and not hope in sort of like, a very simpleton way. And so I'm thinking about patriotism towards the end of the book. I'm thinking, what does that really mean? And I'm trying to think of that kind of pure patriotism before you even knew what patriotism was. When you're just this little kid and you're hearing those beautiful words, and liberty and justice for all, or like one people, or like, what are the other ones? Like, we the people, the whole 9 yards, and you're not aware of what Democrats are, Republicans are. You don't know what a caucus is. So I still don't know what a caucus is. But so I'm trying to think about that innocent patriotism that for me came down to, I remember singing this song, America the Beautiful, which should probably be our national anthem. Sorry, Francis Scott Key. And so I'll sing a little bit for you.
We're on 66, if you're following along.
Oh yeah, 66. America the Beautiful again. How I sang, oh beautiful, like a psalm at church with my mother, her Cuban accent scaling up every vowel. Oh beautiful, yet in perfect pitch, delicate and tuned to the radiant beams of stained glass light. How she taught me to fix my eyes on the crucifix as we sang our thanks to our Savior for this country that saved us. Our voices, hymns as passionate as the organ, piping towards the very heavens. How I sang for spacious skies, closer to those skies while perched on my father's sun-beat shoulders, towering above our first 4th of July parade. How the timber through our bodies mingled, breathing, singing as one, with the brass notes of the marching band playing the only song he ever learned in English. How I dared sing it at assembly with my teenage voice cracking for amber waves of grain that I'd never seen, or purple mountains, majesties, but could imagine them in each verse rising from my gut. Every exclamation of praise I belted out until my throat hurt. America, and again, America. How I began to read Nietzsche and doubt God, yet still wished for God to shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood. I still want to sing, despite all the truth of our wars, and our gunshots ringing louder than school bells, our politicians smiling lies at the mic, the deadlock of our divided voices shouting over each other instead of singing together. How I want to sing again. Beautiful or not, just to be in harmony, from sea to shining sea, with the only country I know enough to know how to sing for.
Oh, thank you so much. Please give it up for Richard Blanco one more time. Thank you so much. I took out my pen because I'm going to get my book signed, but we will be doing a book signing in the lobby, just following this afterwards. And do you guys have anything else to say? That's it. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in the lobby.